The pyramids have stood in silence for thousands of years, quietly letting us guess. That's right, you're listening to Made for Sleep, where history unfolds slowly and without urgency. Tonight, we explore why pyramids aren't actually what we think they are, not to overturn everything, but to look again at what may have been misunderstood beneath desert skies. Let the fire glow steady as the story shifts perspective, and if you'd like, let me know how you're doing in the comments and what time it is where you're listening from. The Nile Delta stretches before you in the late 4th millennium BCE, a world of reed marshes and seasonal floods, where the greatest architectural achievements are still mud brick shrines and wooden fishing platforms. No one here has conceived of building in stone on a massive scale, and the desert plateau that will one day hold monuments is just another stretch of limestone and sand where jackals hunt at dusk. The western horizon smells different than the river valley. You notice this immediately when you climb the low escarpment that separates the fertile black soil from the endless ochre plateau. Down in the floodplain, everything carries the rich wet smell of silt and growing things. Papyrus stalks, fish drying on racks, the green scent of barley fields after irrigation. Up here on the Giza Plateau, the air tastes of dust and heat-cracked stone, sharp and mineral against the roof of your mouth. Your sandals crunch on gravel that's been the same since before your grandmother's grandmother was born. This limestone bedrock runs for miles, flat enough in places that you can see the curve of the earth where the desert meets the sky. In summer, the plateau shimmers with heat that makes the horizon liquid. In winter, the nights get cold enough that you wake before dawn with frost on your woolen cloak, though by mid-morning you'll be sweating again. Nothing much grows here. A few tough grasses find purchase in cracks. Occasionally you'll spot the delicate tracks of a desert fox or the heavier prints of a jackal, but mostly it's just stone and sand and sky. The rock beneath your feet is packed with the fossils of ancient sea creatures, tiny shells and spiral forms that speak of an ocean that covered this land so long ago that no human memory or story reaches back to it. Sometimes, when the wind erodes the surface just right, these fossils emerge like small mysteries, creatures from another world entirely. You're here because the desert represents something the river valley cannot. Down in the black land, everything decays, wood rots, mud brick dissolves in the next flood. Bodies buried in the earth become part of the soil within seasons. But up here, the dryness preserves. A dead bird can lie intact for years, desiccated but whole. A basket abandoned on the sand keeps its shape through decades. This place resists change in a way that feels almost supernatural to someone raised in the valley's endless cycle of flood and growth and harvest and decay. The earliest people who came up here weren't thinking about pyramids. They were thinking about their dead. In the valley you bury someone in the morning, and by evening the earth has already begun reclaiming them. But in the desert sand something different happens. The bodies dry out instead of decomposing. The hot sand and lack of moisture create a kind of accidental preservation. Your ancestors discovered this probably by chance. Maybe a body that couldn't be buried properly in the valley, left in a shallow desert grave, and later uncovered by wind, was found to be intact in an unsettling way. This discovery changed how people thought about death. If the body could be preserved, perhaps something else was preserved too. Perhaps the person themselves, their essence, whatever made them who they were, remained in some form as long as the physical shell remained. This logic, simple and profound, would echo through thousands of years of Egyptian mortuary practice. The early graves were modest, simple pits in the sand, sometimes lined with reed mats or wooden planks. The body would be positioned carefully, often curled on its side as if sleeping. Personal items were placed nearby, pottery vessels that once held food and drink, tools the person had used in life, jewellery if they'd been wealthy enough to own any. These weren't elaborate tombs. They were practical arrangements based on an emerging belief that death was a transition, not an ending. Walk across this plateau in those early centuries, and you'd find these gravesites scattered seemingly at random, wherever families had chosen to bury their dead away from the valley's moisture. Some areas became preferred, probably because someone important was buried there first, and then their descendants wanted to be nearby. Over generations, these informal cemeteries accumulated, layers of burials, some disturbed by wind, others marked with simple stone cairns or wooden posts. The desert wasn't pristine or empty. It was a working landscape. People quarried stone here, cutting blocks of limestone from outcrops where the rock was relatively soft and uniform. They hunted here too, tracking oryx and gazelle through the wadis. They gathered gypsum for plaster and ochre for paint. The plateau was a resource, useful but harsh, valuable but unwelcoming. No one was thinking about pyramids because the very concept didn't exist yet. The tallest structures in the world were probably the towers of mud brick that mark the corners of the important compounds in the valley towns, maybe 3 or 4 meters high. Impressive in their own right, but nothing that would be visible from any real distance. Architecture was still fundamentally horizontal. Long, low buildings clustered together, walls defining space rather than volume. The night sky here looks different than it does in the valley. Without the moisture and vegetation to scatter light, the stars appear harder and brighter. The Milky Way stretches overhead like a river of its own, and the planets move through the constellations with a regularity that must have seemed significant to people trying to understand the structure of their world. You can lie on the warm rock after sunset and watch the stars wheel overhead and feel the immensity of the dark pressing down. This is the world before the great monuments, before stone architecture on a scale that would dominate the landscape for miles, before the logistics of moving million-pound blocks and coordinating thousands of workers and organising the resources of an entire kingdom toward a single construction project. This is the desert as it had been for thousands of years, as it would be for a few hundred more until someone had an idea that would change everything. When European travellers first encountered the pyramids in any meaningful way, we're talking about the 17th and 18th centuries here, they arrived with certain expectations about what ancient monuments should be. They'd studied classical texts that mentioned the pyramids briefly, mostly focused on their size or the supposed engineering marvels involved. They came from cultures that built cathedrals and palaces, structures meant to inspire awe, but also to be used, inhabited, filled with the business of living. The pyramids confused them. Here were enormous buildings that seemed to have no interior space to speak of. Solid stone mostly, with a few cramped passages leading to small chambers. No grand halls, no evidence of residential use, no clear purpose that matched European architectural logic, so they guessed. And their guesses tell you more about 17th century Europe than about ancient Egypt. Some decided the pyramids must be granaries, built to store grain against famine. This idea had biblical precedent. Joseph storing grain during the 7 fat years to prepare for the 7 lean ones. Never mind that the internal volume was far too small for any practical grain storage, or that building in solid stone made no sense when mud brick granaries worked perfectly well. The biblical connection was compelling enough that the idea persisted for decades. Others looked at the precise astronomical alignments and decided the pyramids must be observatories, ancient temples to celestial knowledge. This made a certain sense to European scholars who'd grown up in a tradition that associated ancient wisdom with astronomy and mathematics. Surely these massive structures, aligned so carefully to the cardinal directions, must have served some sophisticated scientific purpose. A few imaginative souls suggested the pyramids were initiation temples where ancient priests conducted mysterious rites. This theory drew on romantic notions of Egyptian mysticism and secret knowledge, ideas that were very popular in certain intellectual circles, but had essentially no archaeological evidence supporting them. The thing is, nobody in these early centuries of investigation could read hieroglyphics. The ancient Egyptian language was completely opaque to European scholarship, so every interpretation had to rely on guesswork, architectural analysis, and classical texts written by Greeks and Romans who themselves were often confused about Egyptian practices and prone to exaggeration. You can almost sympathise with these early investigators. Imagine encountering something so monumental, so precisely constructed, and so apparently purposeless by your own architectural standards. The human mind resists the unknown. It wants to categorise, explain and make sense. So you reach for whatever frameworks you have available. The Arabic scholars who'd studied the pyramids centuries earlier had their own theories. Some believed the pyramids held hidden treasures, not unreasonably given that many royal tombs did contain grave goods. Stories circulated about secret chambers filled with gold and magical artifacts. The 9th century Caliph al-Ma'mun supposedly tunnelled into the Great Pyramids searching for treasure, creating the entrance tourists still use today. He found empty chambers and passages, but no riches, which only fueled speculation about hidden rooms not yet discovered. These early investigations were rough. People hammered and chiselled their way into the structures, looking for treasure or trying to create new passages when the existing ones seemed blocked or too difficult. They damaged hieroglyphic inscriptions through ignorance or carelessness. They removed artifacts without recording their locations or contexts. The pyramids became a kind of quarry for anyone wanting ancient stone, or looking for treasures, real or imagined. Local traditions had their own explanations. Some held that the pyramids were built before the Great Flood mentioned in various religious texts, constructed by a race of giants or by people possessed of knowledge now lost. These stories weren't entirely baseless. The pyramids were indeed ancient beyond normal human reckoning, built using techniques that weren't immediately obvious to people standing at their base. What's interesting is how resistant these early theories were to evidence. Even as travellers produced more detailed measurements and drawings, even as scholars compared the pyramids to other ancient structures, the preferred explanations remained rooted in whatever cultural framework the investigator brought with them. A biblical scholar saw biblical connections. A mystically inclined romantic saw ancient wisdom and secret rites. A practical administrator saw granaries or treasuries. The pyramids themselves remained silent on their purpose. Unlike Greek or Roman buildings, which often carried inscriptions explaining their dedicational purpose, the exterior surfaces of the pyramids had mostly been stripped of any identifying marks. The smooth limestone casing stones that once covered the structures had been carried off over centuries to build Cairo and other settlements. What remained was the rough inner core, stepped and weathered, revealing the construction method but not the meaning. Inside, the passages and chambers offered few clues. The empty sarcophagus in the Great Pyramid's main chamber suggested a burial, but there was no mummy, no treasure, no clear evidence of who had been interred there or when. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that did survive were often quarry marks or administrative notes, not explanatory texts. It was like finding an enormous filing cabinet with all the files removed, leaving only the structure itself to speak. Some investigators noticed that the pyramids sat on the west bank of the Nile. In Egyptian cosmology, as eventually became clear once hieroglyphics could be read, the west was associated with death and the afterlife, the direction where the sun set, where it descended into the underworld each evening. But without that linguistic key, the location choice was just another mystery. The sheer number of pyramids added to the confusion. The famous 3 at Giza grabbed attention, but the Nile Valley held dozens of others, some well preserved, others partially collapsed or buried in sand. They varied in size and design, suggesting evolution or experimentation, but without chronological markers or readable inscriptions, it was impossible to establish which came first, or how the designs developed over time. You can walk through these early accounts and feel the investigators' frustration building. Here was evidence of a sophisticated civilization, clearly capable of monumental engineering and mathematical precision, yet their purpose remained stubbornly obscure. Every measurement revealed new precision, new alignments, new evidence of careful planning. But precision toward what end? The limestone block sits at your feet, weighing about as much as 2 modern cars. Actually, considerably more, roughly 2.5 tons, though nobody here thinks in those terms. It's just a block of stone that took a team of workers 3 days to cut from the quarry face, using copper chisels and wooden wedges and a lot of patient hammering. Your hands are already blistered from rope work, and the day has barely started. The sun hasn't cleared the eastern cliffs yet, but you're sweating anyway, anticipation and exertion mixing in the cool dawn air. Around you, several dozen other workers are preparing similar blocks, checking the wooden sledges, wetting the sand, and organising themselves into pulling teams. The logistics of moving stone are straightforward in concept and nightmarish in execution. Someone, probably several someones working over months, figured out the optimal team size for blocks of different weights. Too few workers and you can't generate enough force to overcome friction. Too many, and you're wasting labour, feeding people who aren't contributing to the actual movement. For this particular block, the calculation suggests 16 pullers. You're not pulling today, you're one of the wetting crew, which sounds easier but isn't really. Your job is to keep the sand in front of the sledge properly moistened. Too dry and the friction becomes enormous. Too wet and the sledge bogs down. There's a sweet spot where the sand becomes slightly slick, where the limestone runners of the sledge can slide rather than dig in. Finding that sweet spot and maintaining it while the block moves requires constant attention. The water comes from the Nile, obviously, carried up in pottery vessels by a dedicated team who do nothing but shuttle back and forth from the river to the construction site. They're mostly younger workers, teenagers who haven't developed the muscle mass for heavy pulling, but who have the endurance for repetitive hauling. Some of them have developed specialised carrying techniques, balanced loads that let them move more water with less effort. The ropes are papyrus, thick as your wrist and surprisingly strong. They're also expensive, representing weeks of skilled labour to produce and maintain. A snapped rope doesn't just halt work, it can injure workers and damage the block. So rope inspection happens constantly. Any signs of fraying or weakness, and the rope gets retired from heavy pulling, relegated to lighter tasks until it finally becomes unusable. The sledge itself is massive timber, probably cedar from Lebanon, because local wood isn't strong enough or large enough for this purpose. The runners are shaped to distribute the block's weight evenly, designed with a slight curve that helps with manoeuvrability. The whole apparatus represents sophisticated carpentry, joints that hold under tremendous stress, wood selection that balances strength and weight, and design that's been refined over generations of trial and error. Movement begins with a call and response chant. One person sets the rhythm, everyone else pulling in unison. This isn't just about coordination, though that matters. It's about psychology. Individual workers can slack off, preserve energy, and let others do the work. But when you're chanting together, responding together, moving as a synchronized unit, social pressure keeps everyone engaged. You can't hide in a team of 16 when everyone's voice is part of the rhythm. The block moves, not quickly. You're looking at maybe 20 meters per hour on good terrain, less when you're climbing the ramp that leads up to the current construction level, but it moves, consistently, inevitably. The combination of human muscle, a wooden sledge, moistened sand, and coordinated effort overcomes the massive weight. Your job is to stay ahead of the sledge, pouring water and watching the sand's consistency. You develop an eye for it. The colour changes when moisture content is right. The texture, the way it clumps or flows, tells you when to add more water or let it dry slightly. You're reading sand the way a baker reads dough. Halfway to the ramp, there's a rest. The team leaders rotate workers, checking for exhaustion or injury. Someone has developed a blister that's bleeding, so they get pulled from the line and someone fresh takes their place. Water gets distributed. Not too much. You don't want people too heavy or needing to urinate during a critical pull, but enough to maintain hydration. The ramp represents a different challenge entirely. It's built of mud, brick and rubble, sloping up to the current construction level at an angle that's carefully calculated. Too steep and the teams can't pull the blocks up. Too shallow and the ramp becomes impossibly long, requiring more material and more time to build and maintain. The current angle seems to be about 1 metre of rise for every 10 metres of horizontal distance, which sounds gentle until you're trying to haul 2.5 tons up it. Additional teams join for the ramp section. 40 workers now, some pulling, some pushing from behind, some on the sides for stability. The chant changes and becomes more urgent. The effort becomes visible in straining muscles, in feet digging for purchase, and in the creaking of rope and wood. You're running ahead now, water sloshing from your vessel, trying to wet the steeper sections before the sledge reaches them. The ramp's surface gets compacted by all this traffic and becomes almost smooth in places, which helps, but it also develops ruts that need to be filled and levelled. There's a whole team dedicated to ramp maintenance, working constantly to repair damage, add material where the ramp's being worn down, and ensure the surface stays functional. The block reaches the construction level. The team manoeuvres it into approximate position, then specialist workers take over with smaller levers and wooden rockers, fine-tuning placement. This is precision work. The blocks need to fit together closely enough that even a thin blade can't slip between them. The entire structure's stability depends on this tight fitting. Multiply this scene by hundreds of thousands of blocks. The Great Pyramid alone contains roughly 2.3 million stone blocks, each requiring similar effort to quarry, transport and place. Some blocks are smaller than the one you've been working with. Many are much larger, especially in the internal chambers where granite blocks weighing up to 80 tons were somehow moved and positioned. The organisational infrastructure required for this construction is staggering when you think about it. Someone has to feed all these workers. That means farming, fishing, baking bread and brewing beer. Someone has to house them, which means building barracks or organising temporary settlements. Someone has to provide tools and maintain them. Copper for chisels, wood for handles, rope for pulling. Someone has to coordinate the quarrying so blocks arrive at the construction site at a steady rate, neither too fast nor too slow. There's evidence of specialised workers, skilled stone masons who could cut blocks with remarkable precision, surveyors who could establish alignments and maintain the pyramid's geometric accuracy as it rose, engineers who calculated ramp angles and designed the internal passages and chambers, administrators who tracked labour, resources and timelines, physicians who treated injuries and illnesses in a workforce that numbered in the thousands. And there's seasonality to consider. During the Nile's flood season, when the valley was underwater and farming impossible, the available workforce swelled dramatically. Farmers became temporary construction workers, bringing agricultural muscle to the monument. The flood also made transportation easier. Blocks could be floated on barges much of the way from distant quarries, saving enormous effort compared to overland hauling. The whole enterprise required a functioning state apparatus capable of mobilising resources, organising labour, maintaining supply chains, and sustaining effort over decades. This wasn't slave labour in the traditional sense. Recent archaeological work at workers' settlements shows that the builders were paid, fed well enough to grow strong on a diet of meat and bread, and received medical care. They were participants in a national project, probably religiously significant, definitely prestigious. At the end of your shift, you're exhausted in a way that feels almost clean. Your muscles ache, your hands are ruined, and you'll sleep heavily tonight. But the block you helped move is in place, part of something that will outlast everyone you know by thousands of years. There's satisfaction in that, in contributing to something monumental. The religious significance of the pyramids wasn't mysterious to the ancient Egyptians themselves. They had entire theological frameworks explaining why a king needed a pyramid, what it accomplished, and how it functioned in the cosmic order. The mystery is a modern invention, born from the gap between losing the cultural context and regaining the ability to read the hieroglyphic texts. The pyramid wasn't just a tomb. Calling it a tomb is like calling a cathedral a meeting hall. Technically accurate, but missing most of the point. The pyramid was a machine for resurrection, a launching platform for the royal soul, a guarantee of cosmic continuity. Understanding this requires understanding how Egyptians thought about death, the soul, and the relationship between the king and the gods. First, the soul. Except there wasn't just one soul. The Egyptians conceived of multiple spiritual components, each with different characteristics and needs. The Ka was your life force, your vital essence. The Bi'al was something like personality, the aspect that could move between the world of the living and the afterlife. The Ash was what you became if everything went right after death, a transfigured, effective spirit. There were others too, parts of identity that modern Western thought doesn't really distinguish. All these components needed care after death. The physical body had to be preserved because the Ka required it as a kind of anchor point. This drove the development of mummification, that elaborate process of preservation that started simple and became increasingly sophisticated. But preservation wasn't enough. The deceased needed sustenance, food, drink, clothing. They needed to be remembered, their name spoken, their identity maintained. For a king, these needs were magnified because the king wasn't just an individual. He was the living embodiment of divine order, the mediator between the gods and humanity, the guarantor of cosmic stability. When a king died, it created a crisis. The connection between human and divine realms was threatened. The new king needed to establish his own divine connection, while ensuring the old king successfully transitioned to the afterlife, where he would join the gods and continue protecting Egypt from the realm of the dead. The pyramid served multiple functions in this theological framework. Its shape echoed the Benben, the primordial mound that emerged from the waters of chaos at creation. Building a pyramid was like recreating that first act of creation, establishing a point of stability and order. The pyramid's peak was a place where earth and sky met, where the boundary between mortal and divine realms grew thin. The internal passages and chambers weren't practical spaces. They were ritual architecture, designed to facilitate the king's spiritual journey. The ascending passage pointed toward the circumpolar stars, those stars that never set, where the king's spirit was supposed to dwell eternally. The chamber proportions often reflected sacred geometries, ratios that held religious significance. The pyramid complex included more than just the pyramid itself. There was a mortuary temple on the eastern face where priests performed daily rituals, offering food and drink and incense to the deceased king's Ka. There was a causeway connecting this temple to a valley temple down near the Nile, a raised corridor where processions moved during religious festivals. There were subsidiary pyramids for queens, and later for the king's internal organs stored in canopic jars. All of this required permanent staff, priests who performed the daily rites, rotating through shifts that could continue for generations after the king's death. Administrators who managed the land and resources dedicated to maintaining the cult. Farmers whose harvests supported the entire operation. The pyramid created an economic and religious institution that outlasted the king himself. The texts that eventually appeared in later pyramids, the pyramid texts, spell out some of this theology in remarkable detail. They're spells, essentially instructions and magical formulae designed to help the king navigate the afterlife. Some are protective, warding off dangers in the underworld. Some are transformative, helping the king assume divine forms. Some are assertive, declarations of the king's divine nature and right to join the gods. Reading these texts is like overhearing one side of a complex conversation. They reference myths and theological concepts that were common knowledge to ancient Egyptians, but which we have to piece together from fragments. They assume familiarity with the afterlife's geography, with the gods' personalities and relationships, and with rituals we can only partially reconstruct. What becomes clear is that death wasn't an ending but a transition, and a dangerous one. The journey through the underworld involved navigating obstacles, answering challenges, and avoiding demons and hostile forces. The pyramid, the mummification, the grave goods, the continuing rituals, all of these were support systems for that journey, equipment and provisions and magical protection for the deceased king. The political dimension of this was significant too. Building a pyramid demonstrated the king's power and the state's organizational capacity. It employed thousands, redistributed resources, and made visible the king's ability to command labour and materials on an unprecedented scale. The pyramid became a permanent marker of the king's reign, impossible to ignore, dominating the landscape for anyone approaching from the valley. Nobles and officials competed for burial plots near the king's pyramid. Being buried in proximity to the royal tomb meant being part of the king's eternal household, maintaining in death the relationship they'd held in life. These subsidiary tombs, called mastabas, lined up in neat rows around the pyramid, creating vast necropolises that mirrored the hierarchical structure of the living society. The pyramid's orientation mattered, aligned to the cardinal directions with remarkable precision. The structure integrated astronomical observations into its very fabric. The stars, the sun's path, the cosmic order, all of these were written into the monument's design. This wasn't primitive superstition, but a sophisticated theological system that saw divine order reflected in celestial movements and earthly structures alike. Over time, the pyramid form evolved. Early step pyramids gave way to true pyramids with smooth sides. The angle of the sides changed as engineers learned from partial collapses and structural issues. The complexity of internal chambers and passages varied, sometimes elaborate and sometimes simpler. Each king's pyramid reflected not just his resources and reign length, but also theological developments and engineering innovations. What's remarkable is the continuity. For over 1,000 years, Egyptian kings kept building pyramids. The form persisted even as details changed, even as Egypt went through periods of strength and weakness, even as theological emphasis shifted. The pyramid became traditional, the expected memorial for a proper king, a link to ancestors, and a statement of cosmic importance. The chamber you're standing in wasn't designed for mysterious rituals or hidden treasure. It's a weight-relieving gallery, a piece of engineering meant to solve a very specific structural problem. The massive stone ceiling above you would crack and collapse under the pyramid's weight. Without these 5 granite slabs stacked above each other, each layer separated by a gap that allows the tremendous downward force to distribute across multiple surfaces, instead of concentrating on a single point. Look up, and you can see the underside of those relieving slabs, rough and unfinished because nobody was ever supposed to see them. The spaces between them are cramped, barely tall enough to crouch in, filled with bat guano and dust from millennia of neglect. But they work. They've worked for 4,500 years, keeping the king's chamber from becoming a crushed ruin under millions of tons of stone. This is the practical reality that often gets lost in speculation about secret chambers and hidden passages. The pyramid's internal features served functions, solved problems, and reflected engineering challenges that the builders faced and overcame through clever design and hard-earned experience. The ventilation shafts are another example. These narrow passages run from the king's and queen's chambers up through the pyramid's mass to open on the exterior faces. Early investigators thought they must be symbolic, pathways for the king's soul to ascend to the stars. And maybe they were, partly, but they also moved air. Standing in the king's chamber, you can feel the draft. Cool air flows in, creating circulation that would have been crucial when the chamber was sealed and priests were performing rituals inside. The shafts are too small for a person to traverse. Roughly 20 centimeters square, they snake through the stone at specific angles, avoiding other internal features, maintaining their orientation despite the complexity of the surrounding structure. Building them required planning ahead, coordinating the work of different teams, ensuring that as the pyramid rose, the shafts maintained their alignment. It's subtle work, easy to overlook, but representing significant engineering expertise. The Grand Gallery is often described as mysterious, but it's primarily functional. This ascending passage, nearly 9 meters high and sloping upward toward the king's chamber, served as a storage space for the granite plugs that would seal the ascending passage after the king's burial. Those plugs, massive blocks designed to slide down and block access, needed to be held in position until the right moment. The gallery's height and the grooves cut into its walls allowed the plugs to be suspended, ready to be released when the time came. Walking through the gallery now, you can see the grooves and the corbelled ceiling that create strength through geometry, rather than material mass. Each stone course overlaps the one below it slightly, creating an arch effect that transfers weight outward to the walls rather than straight down through the passage. It's the same principle that holds up stone bridges and cathedral vaults, adapted to this specific architectural challenge. The portcullis system in the antechamber represents another practical solution. These vertical granite slabs could be lowered to block access to the king's chamber, creating multiple barriers that would make tomb robbing more difficult. They didn't work. Tomb robbers are persistent and creative, but the intent was practical security, not mystical protection. Even the sarcophagus placement reflects practical considerations. The granite box in the king's chamber is larger than the passages leading to the room, which means it had to be installed during construction before the ceiling was completed. This timing detail constrained the construction sequence, required careful coordination between different work crews, and shows planning that integrated the chamber's contents with its architecture. The unfinished chambers beneath the pyramid tell their own story. The subterranean chamber, carved into the bedrock below the pyramid, appears to have been abandoned partway through construction. The floor is rough, the ceiling irregular, and passages lead nowhere. This wasn't mysterious. It was a change in plan. Perhaps the king decided he wanted his burial chamber higher up within the pyramid's mass rather than beneath it. Perhaps there were structural concerns about the bedrock's quality. Whatever the reason, work stopped and resources shifted to creating new chambers higher in the structure. These unfinished spaces preserve evidence of working methods. You can see the pick marks on the walls, the progression of the cutting, and the places where workers adjusted their approach when they encountered harder stone or unexpected fissures. It's like archaeological evidence of the construction process itself, frozen at the moment work ceased. The pyramid's casing stones, mostly stripped away over centuries, were practical as well as aesthetic. That smooth white limestone surface wasn't just beautiful. It protected the internal core from weathering channeled rainwater, rare but destructive when it occurred, and created the geometric purity that gave the pyramid its symbolic power. Each casing stone was cut with remarkable precision, the joints so tight that modern engineers struggle to understand how they were achieved with copper tools. The foundation work is less visible, but equally impressive. The pyramid's base was levelled to within a few centimetres across its entire 200-metre footprint. This required sophisticated surveying techniques, probably involving water-filled channels cut into the bedrock that allowed builders to establish a true level across long distances. Get the foundation wrong, and every course afterward compounds the error. Get it right, and the massive structure remains stable. Drainage was another practical concern. The internal chambers sit above the water table, but moisture management still mattered. You can find small channels designed to move any water that did penetrate away from critical areas, preventing the slow damage that seeping water causes to stone and mortar. The choice of materials reflected practical knowledge too. Limestone is the bulk of the structure. Abundant, relatively easy to work and strong enough for the purpose. Granite for chambers and critical structural elements, much harder, much heavier, but essentially indestructible. The builders understood material properties, knew which stone to use where, and sourced materials from quarries sometimes hundreds of kilometres away, when local resources weren't adequate. Even the seemingly symbolic features often had practical dimensions. The pyramid's alignment to true north, precise within a tiny fraction of a degree, was achieved through astronomical observation, probably sighting circumpolar stars and finding the midpoint of their rotation. This required knowledge, instruments, and careful measurement, but it was practical astronomy, using celestial markers to establish earthly orientation. The pyramid's angle, approximately 51 degrees, represents a balance between structural stability and material efficiency. Steeper and you risk structural failure as the weight concentrates too much at the base. Shallower and you're using far more material than necessary to achieve the desired height. That 51-degree angle appears repeatedly in Egyptian pyramids because it worked. It was the sweet spot where engineering and resources aligned. By the time Herodotus visited Egypt in the 5th century BCE, the pyramids were already ancient. More time separated Herodotus from the pyramid builders than separates us from Herodotus. The Greeks saw the pyramids as impossibly old, built by a civilization that seemed almost mythical in its antiquity, and they started telling stories. Herodotus recorded what the Egyptian priest told him, but you can hear the storytelling embellishment in his account. He mentions 100,000 workers labouring for 20 years, which sounds dramatic but is probably inflated. He recounts stories about the king who built the Great Pyramid supposedly prostituting his daughter to raise construction funds, a tale that's almost certainly fiction, reflecting Greek assumptions about tyrannical excess rather than Egyptian reality. These stories spread and evolved. By the medieval period, European and Arabic scholars had lost the ability to read hieroglyphics entirely. The pyramids became blank slates onto which any story could be projected. Some claimed they were repositories of pre-flood knowledge, built by Noah or his descendants. Others suggested they were astronomical calculators, built by ancient sages who'd mastered sciences now lost. The measurements of the Great Pyramid became numerological puzzles. Investigators found or imagined correspondences between the pyramid's dimensions and various cosmic constants. The base perimeter supposedly encoded the circumference of the Earth. The height reflected astronomical distances. The chamber proportions contained mathematical truths. Most of these correspondences were coincidental or forced. If you measure something complex enough ways, you'll eventually find numbers that seem significant. But these mathematical mysteries captured imaginations. The idea that the pyramid builders possessed advanced knowledge, perhaps even superior to modern science, appealed to people who wanted to believe in lost golden ages or ancient wisdom. The pyramid became proof of whatever the observer most wanted to prove: advanced astronomy, divine inspiration, visitations from advanced civilizations, you name it. The Napoleon story is illustrative. Legend says Napoleon spent a night alone in the king's chamber and emerged shaken, refusing to speak about what he'd experienced. It's a great story. It's also completely unverifiable and probably false. But it persists because it captures something people want to believe: that the pyramid holds mysteries capable of affecting even the powerful and ambitious. Treasure hunting shaped the pyramid's story too. The belief that immense riches lay hidden within drove countless destructive investigations. Caliph al-Mamun's 9th century tunnelling created new passages that later investigators mistook for original features. Treasure seekers widened passages, damaged chambers, and removed anything portable that might have value. The stripped casing stones themselves became part of the mythology. Early accounts describe the Great Pyramid covered in smooth white limestone, inscribed with hieroglyphic text. Later visitors found the casing stripped away, the stones carried off to build Cairo. This disappearance fueled speculation about what the inscriptions had said. Lost knowledge, historical records and religious texts, all supposedly destroyed when the stones were repurposed. The Victorian era brought pseudoscience into the mix. Pyramidology emerged as a field, complete with elaborate theories about the pyramid's proportions encoding prophecy or historical timelines. Charles Piazzi Smith, Astronomer Royal of Scotland, published extensive measurements supposedly proving the pyramid was built by divine inspiration to encode scientific and historical knowledge. His work influenced generations of believers despite being thoroughly debunked by actual Egyptologists. These alternative theories persist, partly because the real story is less immediately thrilling. Yes, the pyramids are remarkable engineering achievements. Yes, they required sophisticated organization and mathematical knowledge, but they were built by humans using period-appropriate tools and techniques for religious and political purposes that made sense within their cultural context. That's fascinating if you take time to understand it, but it lacks the instant mystique of ancient astronauts or lost super civilizations. The movies and popular media haven't helped. Pyramids became shorthand for ancient mysteries, usually involving curses, treasure, or supernatural phenomena. The image of the pyramid, that perfect geometric form rising from the desert, became divorced from the historical reality, turned into a symbol that could mean anything the storyteller wanted. What's odd is how resistant these stories are to evidence. Archaeological work has revealed worker settlements, tool marks on stones, construction diagrams, and administrative records detailing food rations and work schedules. We understand a remarkable amount about how the pyramids were built and why, but the mystery narratives persist, partly because they're more emotionally satisfying than reality, and partly because they've become traditions in their own right. The Sphinx accumulated its own mythology, separate from but intertwined with the pyramid stories. Some claimed it predated the pyramids by thousands of years, built by an earlier advanced civilization. Geologists examined the erosion patterns and mostly agreed the weathering was consistent with the accepted dating, but the alternative theories kept circulating. Even serious scholars sometimes got caught up in speculation. The perfectly aligned passages, the precise measurements, the astronomical orientations, these genuine achievements got inflated into evidence of knowledge that shouldn't have existed. The builders were credited with understanding mathematical constants that wouldn't be formally calculated for millennia, with astronomical knowledge beyond what their tools should have allowed, and with engineering capabilities that seemed anachronistic. What's been lost in all this storytelling is appreciation for what the pyramid builders actually accomplished, which is impressive enough without embellishment. They moved millions of tons of stone with human muscle and basic tools. They created structures that have lasted 45 centuries and will likely last thousands more. They coordinated resources and labour on a scale that's remarkable even by modern standards. They built essentially eternal monuments to their civilization and their rulers, but that's not mysterious enough for some people. So the stories grow and multiply, each generation adding new layers of speculation, until the pyramid becomes whatever the observer needs it to be: proof of aliens, repository of lost knowledge, prophetic calculator, mystical power source. The actual historical artifact gets buried under the mythology. The archaeological dig at the workers' settlement near the pyramid started almost by accident. Someone was surveying for a modern construction project when they noticed pottery fragments eroding out of the sand. That led to closer examination. That led to excavation. And suddenly we had access to the daily lives of the people who built the pyramids. The settlement wasn't glamorous. Rows of simple mud brick housing, communal bakeries, workshops, waste pits filled with broken pottery, animal bones, and discarded tools. But it was evidence, hard data about how the construction workforce actually lived and worked. The animal bones told nutritional stories, lots of cattle, sheep, and goats. These workers were eating meat regularly, more than typical agricultural workers could expect. Someone was provisioning them well, ensuring they maintained the strength needed for heavy labour. The evidence suggested systematic supply chains bringing food from across Egypt to feed the workforce. Tool marks on the pyramid stones matched the copper and stone tools found in the workers' settlement. You could trace specific techniques, the way chisels were angled to split stone, the progression of cuts that shaped blocks, the finishing work that created smooth surfaces. This wasn't a mystery, it was skilled craftsmanship, learned through training and refined through practice. Graffiti inside the pyramid revealed work gang names. Teams identified themselves with names like Friends of Khufu or Drunkards of Menkaure. These weren't slave teams, but organised crews with their own identities and apparently some esprit de corps. The graffiti was casual, the kind of marking workers have always left. Proof that they were there, that they contributed. Little claims to immortality carved into stone that would last far longer than their names in any official record. Medical examination of skeletal remains from the workers' cemetery showed heavy wear patterns consistent with hard labour, arthritis in joints, compressed vertebrae, and bone damage from repetitive stress. But they also showed evidence of medical care. Broken bones that had been set and healed, amputations that had been performed carefully enough that the person survived and continued living for years afterward. Someone was caring for injured workers, not just discarding them. The settlement's layout suggested organisation beyond just housing. There were administrative buildings, suggesting record-keeping and management. There were specialised workshops for different trades, carpentry, stoneworking and rope-making. The economy of the settlement was complex, with division of labour and specialised production. Pottery analysis revealed trade connections. Some vessels came from distant parts of Egypt, suggesting that the settlement was integrated into broader economic networks. The pyramid construction wasn't isolated, but part of a functioning economy that moved goods and resources across long distances. The bakeries were particularly revealing. Industrial-scale bread production, with standardised loaves that could be distributed as rations. Brewing facilities indicated regular beer production, since beer was a dietary staple, safer than water and providing calories and nutrition. This wasn't ad hoc feeding, but systematic provisioning. Excavation of the pyramid complex itself revealed construction techniques. Ramps that had been built up and later dismantled. Tool caches were buried when work moved to new areas. Quarry marks on stones indicating which team had cut them, and sometimes which part of the pyramid they were destined for. The organisational infrastructure became visible in these details. The true precision of the pyramid's construction became clear through modern surveying. The base is level to within centimetres across its entire footprint. The sides aligned to the cardinal directions within fractions of a degree. The internal passages maintain their orientations despite the massive weight bearing down on them. This precision wasn't accidental, but reflected sophisticated surveying and construction control techniques. Analysis of the mortar between stones revealed its composition, gypsum-based, sometimes with added components that improved its properties. The mortar wasn't structural. The pyramid's stability comes from the precise fitting of stones, not from bonding, but it helped with positioning and provided some protection from moisture. Study of the quarries where the stone was cut showed the evolution of techniques. Earlier quarries showed more experimental cutting and more variation in block size and shape. Later quarries showed standardization, refined methods, and increased efficiency. The builders were learning, improving their techniques across decades of continuous work. The causeway connecting the Valley Temple to the pyramid complex revealed its own engineering challenges. It had to maintain a specific grade while spanning uneven terrain, requiring earthworks and support structures. The scale of the undertaking extended beyond just the pyramid itself to include the entire ritual complex. Excavation around subsidiary pyramids revealed burial goods and remains that helped establish chronology. Who was buried near which king's pyramid, what grave goods were included, and what titles the deceased held. All of this built up a picture of the royal court and its organisation. Chemical analysis of residues in vessels found traces of offerings, oils, unguents, food, remains. The continuing cult of the deceased king involved regular presentations of goods, sustaining the pyramid complex as a functioning religious institution for generations after the king's death. The discovery of papyrus fragments containing administrative records was revolutionary. These weren't grand theological texts, but work logs, delivery receipts, and shift schedules. The mundane paperwork of a massive construction project, preserved by the desert's dryness. They showed the organisational hierarchy, the chain of supply, and the tracking of materials and labour. What emerged from all this archaeological work was a picture of the pyramid as a project, not a mystery. A massive undertaking, yes, but one accomplished through organisation, resources, skilled labour and time. The supernatural wasn't required. What was required was a functioning state capable of mobilising and sustaining effort at an unprecedented scale. The sandstorm comes up suddenly, the way they do out here. One moment the air is clear and the horizon sharp. Next, the western sky has turned ochre and the wind carries the taste of the distant desert. You've got maybe 15 minutes before visibility drops to nothing. The pyramids endure this, have endured it for 45 centuries. The sand scours at the limestone, wearing it atom by atom, but the rate of erosion is so slow that even millennia produce barely measurable change. The stone is harder than the wind, more patient than the sand. From the top of the Great Pyramid, back when climbing it was permitted, you could see how the desert and the city were locked in constant struggle. Green fields pushing up against beige sand, Cairo spreading toward the ancient monuments, the desert reclaiming ground during dry years, retreating when the Nile's floods were particularly generous. But the pyramid changed the landscape permanently. Not just physically, though it certainly did that. It established Giza as significant. Settlements grew up around the pyramid complex, sustained by the religious cult and the pilgrims and later the tourists. The monument created its own geography of human activity. Modern Cairo uses medieval Cairo, which uses Roman Cairo, which uses Ptolemaic Cairo, layer upon layer of occupation and rebuilding. And much of that stone, especially in the medieval period, came from the pyramid's casing. The same white limestone that once gleamed in the sun now forms the walls of mosques and houses and fortifications scattered across the city. There's an irony in that. The pyramids were built as eternal monuments, meant to last forever, to preserve the king's name and ensure his afterlife. And they have lasted, but pieces of them are scattered throughout Cairo, repurposed, their original function forgotten by the people who live in houses built from pyramid stone. The Sphinx lost its nose long before the modern era, probably to target practice or deliberate vandalism during some period of religious zeal. The loss changed how the monument is perceived. With a nose, it would look more human, more approachable. Without it, there's something eerie about that massive face, something that invites projection and mystery. Vegetation grows in cracks now, something that wouldn't have been possible when the casing stones kept the surface sealed. Pigeons nest in crevices, insects burrow into the softer mortar. The pyramid is being very slowly colonized by life, incorporated into the ecosystem rather than standing apart from it. The base of the pyramid has been excavated down to the original paving stones in some areas. In others, millennia of blown sand and human debris have raised the ground level by meters. Walking around the perimeter, you're sometimes walking on ancient surfaces, sometimes on accumulations that post-date the pyramid's construction by thousands of years. The archaeological record of the site is deep and complex. Byzantine coins, Roman graffiti, medieval ceramics. Every period of human occupation left traces. The pyramid complex became a palimpsest. New stories written over old, but with the original text still visible beneath. Tourism has its own effects. Millions of feet have worn smooth the passages that were rough when first cut. Handrails and lighting preserve access but change the experience. The pyramid has become a managed site, protected but also presented, curated for visitors who come seeking connection with antiquity. Conservation is an ongoing concern. Salt efflorescence damages the stone as groundwater wicks up through the monument and evaporates at the surface. Pollution from Cairo's traffic creates acid conditions that accelerate weathering. The pyramid, so enduring, is also vulnerable in ways that would surprise people who think of it as eternal, but it endures. The basic form is unchanged from when the last block was placed. The internal chambers remain accessible. The alignment still points true to the cardinal directions. The mathematics of its construction can still be measured and admired. Other pyramids fared worse, collapsed partially or entirely, stripped more completely for stone, buried under sand and only recently re-excavated. The Great Pyramid's survival is partly lucky. It was large enough to be impressive, even after losing its casing, and prominent enough to draw interest and eventual protection. The worker settlements are mostly gone. eroded back to sand or built over by modern development. Only the excavated portions remain, preserved because they were documented, and protected because they're valuable for understanding the larger context. What endures most strongly is the idea of the pyramid. The shape itself, that perfect geometric form, has been copied and referenced for thousands of years. Pyramids appear in architecture worldwide, usually having nothing to do with Egypt but drawing on the form's visual power. The pyramid has become an archetype, a shape that carries meaning separate from its original context. Standing in the desert at dawn, watching the sun rise behind the pyramids, you can understand why people have projected so much onto these monuments. They're impressive in ways that bypass rational analysis and hit something more immediate. Size, precision, age, all combining into an effect that feels profound even if you can't articulate exactly why. The desert remembers not just through the monuments but also through the absence around them. The quarries are now empty and silent. The ramps were long since dismantled for their materials. The camps and settlements dissolved back into sand. The story is as much about what's gone as what remains. The hieroglyphic inscriptions that survived, carved into the chamber walls of later pyramids, speak of continuity. Kings are referring to their predecessors, maintaining traditions and linking themselves to an ancient lineage. The pyramid was new once, revolutionary even. But it became tradition, something expected, a link between past and present and future. The Nile still floods, though the Aswan Dam moderates it now. The desert still encroaches. The sun still rises in the east and sets in the west, as it did when the first pyramid builders laid the foundation stones. Some contexts change, some endure as permanently as the limestone itself. You know that feeling when you're scrolling through your phone at 2 a.m, ignoring every reasonable signal your body sends about needing sleep? Turns out, humans have been spectacularly good at ignoring warnings for thousands of years. The difference is the ancient ones actually wrote theirs down. We just decided they were talking about dragons and curses instead of, actual survival advice. Tonight, we're going to explore those old stories everyone dismissed as superstition, the ones that turned out to be instruction manuals we forgot how to read. Picture yourself sitting in a landscape that doesn't quite make sense to modern eyes. Not ancient in the way movies show it, all torches and mysterious robes, but ancient in a more practical way. A world where the evening sky looks subtly different because there are fewer particles in the atmosphere, where silence actually means silence, not the background hum of distant highways and air conditioning units. You're in what will someday be called the Mediterranean, about 7,000 years ago, in a settlement that archaeology will later label with a catalogue number, instead of the name its inhabitants actually used. 37 houses made of mud, brick and stone, arranged in a rough circle around a central gathering space. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business for better or worse, which honestly hasn't changed much in 7 millennia. The houses have flat roofs where people sleep during hot months, and you can smell bread baking in outdoor ovens, mixed with the sharper scent of goats penned nearby. Someone is crushing grain with a stone. You can hear the rhythmic grinding sound that would become oddly soothing if you lived with it every day. A couple of kids are playing some game involving tossing pebbles, arguing about rules in voices that carry across the whole village. Here's the thing about this place. Nobody wakes up thinking, I'm going to create mythology today. They're thinking about whether the grain storage looks low, whether that cough means someone's actually sick, and whether they should plant barley in the eastern field this year. Practical thoughts. Boring thoughts, really. But there's one person in the village who's older than almost everyone else, maybe 60, which is genuinely impressive for this time period. She's seen things, patterns, the kind of observations that only come from decades of paying attention to the same landscape, the same seasons, and the same subtle shifts that mean something important is about to happen. She's noticed, for instance, that when the swallows arrive later than usual in spring, The summer rains also come late. This has happened enough times that it's not a coincidence. She's also noticed that when certain flowers bloom early, frost sometimes returns and kills the young crops. Again, pattern. Not magic, just weather being weather, following rules she can't explain but can definitely observe. The problem is memory. Her memory is sharp enough, but she won't live forever, and knowledge that exists only in one person's head might as well not exist at all. So she does what humans have done forever when they need to remember something important. She turns it into a story. Not just any story. A good story. The kind people want to hear again. She tells the children that the swallows carry messages from the sky spirits about rain, and that you must always wait for the swallows before planting certain crops. She describes the early blooming flowers as tricksters, beautiful but deceptive, warning farmers not to trust their appearance. Is she lying? Not exactly. She's encoding information in the most durable format available to a preliterate society. Narrative that sticks in memory, passes from parent to child and becomes tradition. The metaphors about spirits and tricksters aren't the point. The instructions hidden inside them are the point. You can see this same pattern everywhere if you look closely enough. The sacred groves that must never be cut down, usually located in areas where tree removal would cause erosion or flooding. The cursed caves that must be avoided, often containing pockets of carbon dioxide or other invisible dangers. The dietary restrictions about certain shellfish during specific months, aligning suspiciously well with seasonal toxin blooms that nobody could measure, but everyone could observe the effects of. The stories spread outward from that village, changing slightly as they travelled. Someone adds a detail about a hero. Someone else makes the trickster flowers into actual malevolent beings. The core instruction remains, but the packaging gets more elaborate, more entertaining, and more memorable. Within a few generations, people are following the rules without necessarily remembering why the rules exist. They just know that grandfather and great-grandfather always waited for the swallows, and things went badly the one year great-uncle decided he knew better. The story has done its job, preserving behaviour that increases survival even after the original reasoning is forgotten. Think about how weird this is. The entire system depends on people following instructions they don't fully understand, embedded in stories they believe for reasons that have nothing to do with empirical observation. It works precisely because humans are naturally good at pattern recognition and storytelling, even when we're not particularly good at distinguishing correlation from causation. Archaeology reveals these layers slowly, frustratingly. You find a settlement that was mysteriously abandoned, and you can measure the flood deposits that came after. You find another one built in what seems like a terrible location, until you realise it's positioned exactly where it would avoid a landslide that apparently happened every few generations. Did the builders know this consciously? Or were they following a tradition about where villages should and shouldn't be built? A tradition that sounded like superstition but was actually distilled geological knowledge? The honest answer is probably both. Some people undoubtedly understood the practical reasons. Others just knew that the ancestors say we don't build there, and that was enough. The result was the same either way. Communities that survived because they listened to stories. You start to notice this pattern everywhere once you're looking for it. The agricultural calendar disguised as religious festivals. The hygiene practices are wrapped in ritual purity. The building techniques are described in terms of pleasing the gods, but, coincidentally, create structures that survive earthquakes better than the ones built by people who ignored the old ways. It's not that the ancients were stupid, it's that they were solving a specific problem. How do you preserve and transmit crucial survival information across generations when you can't write it down? And even if you could, most people couldn't read. You make it memorable. You make it sacred. You make it into something people will defend and preserve, even when they don't remember why it matters. The really clever part is how self-reinforcing the system becomes. If someone ignores the warning and nothing bad happens, well, they were lucky. If something bad does happen, the the story is confirmed and strengthened. Over enough iterations, the warnings that were genuinely useful stick around, while the purely superstitious ones tend to fade unless they serve some other social function, except, of course, when they don't. When everything gets so mixed up together that you can't separate the practical warnings from the cultural barnacles that attach themselves along the way, that's when things get complicated. Here's something that would have seemed absurdly magical to ancient peoples. You can predict the future by counting things and noticing when the numbers change. Not dramatically, just slightly, consistently, in ways that mean something if you're patient enough to watch. You're now in what will eventually become Iraq, around 5,000 years ago, in a city that will collapse and be rebuilt several times before finally being abandoned to the desert. It's evening, and you're standing on a ziggurat step looking at the sky. Not for religious reasons, though religion is certainly involved. You're looking because you're responsible for the agricultural calendar, and that means you need to know exactly when the flood will come. The Tigris and Euphrates don't flood randomly. They flood predictably, following the snowmelt pattern in mountains hundreds of miles away, mountains you've never seen and never will. But you don't need to see them. You just need to track the stars. Certain stars appear in certain positions when the flood is approximately 40 days away. This correlation has been observed and recorded for generations, first in memory, now increasingly in clay tablets, with wedge-shaped marks that represent numbers and concepts. You're not thinking about the physics of planetary motion or the hydrology of watersheds. You're thinking, these stars mean a flood soon. Better warn everyone. The tablets accumulate slowly, year after year. Observations about star positions, notes about flood timing, records of harvest yields, the height of the river on specific dates, all written in a script that most people can't read, stored in a temple where most people aren't allowed, and maintained by a specialized class of people whose entire job is remembering and recording. Here's the uncomfortable part. This system only works if people believe it's sacred. If you tell farmers, I calculated this based on astronomical observations and historical data, they might listen. But if you tell them, the gods have spoken through the stars and the flood comes on this date, they'll actually prepare. Same information, different framing, drastically different results. So the warnings come wrapped in divination and prophecy, not because the record keepers are frauds, but because they understand human psychology in a preliterate society. The sacred is more powerful than the merely practical. The divine command trumps the expert suggestion. If you want people to listen to warnings, you make the warnings come from gods. The tablets themselves are fascinatingly dry when you translate them. Lists of observations, calculations, predictions. The occasional note about whether the prediction was accurate. They read less like mystical prophecies and more like an ancient farmer's almanac, which is essentially what they are. But that's not how they were presented to the broader population. You can see the same pattern in flood myths worldwide. The story of a great flood isn't unique to one culture. It appears independently in dozens of traditions across different continents. For a long time, people assumed this meant there was one actual global flood that everyone remembered. More likely, it means that many different societies experienced significant floods, and many of them encoded warnings about flooding in memorable narrative form. The Mesopotamian flood story, the one that eventually influenced the biblical account, contains oddly specific details about boat building. The dimensions given in the Epic of Gilgamesh, when you actually calculate them, describe a boat design that would be stable in rough water. Not optimally efficient by modern standards, but definitely better than a random guess. Someone knew something about naval architecture and embedded it in mythology. Was there a historical Utnapishtim who survived a catastrophic flood? Probably not. Were there multiple floods across many generations, and did the survivors pass down knowledge about boat building and flood preparation encoded in story form? Much more likely. The myth is a composite, a greatest hits collection of survival wisdom, starring a fictional hero but containing real information. The same thing happens with drought warnings. Societies that survived in marginal environments, deserts, semi-arid regions, places where rainfall varied dramatically year to year, developed elaborate systems for predicting and preparing for dry periods. These systems often involved watching animal behaviour, noting plant flowering times, observing weather patterns, and calculating based on long-term cycles. The problem is, long-term cycles are really hard to track without writing. If drought comes every 7 years, you need institutional memory spanning at least a few cycles to confirm the pattern. That's where ritual comes in. If you perform a specific ceremony every year and note where the drought follows, eventually you accumulate enough data to see the pattern. The ceremony isn't magic. It's a mnemonic device and a data collection protocol disguised as religion. Some of the most successful ancient societies were the ones that got really good at encoding environmental knowledge in cultural practices that persisted across generations. The ones that failed were often the ones that either never developed such systems or, more tragically, had systems that broke down at critical moments. Easter Island is a famous example, though the popular story tends to be oversimplified. The traditional narrative says the islanders cut down all their trees because they were obsessed with building bigger and bigger statues, ignoring obvious warnings until it was too late. The reality is more complicated and in some ways more disturbing. The islanders definitely had knowledge about sustainable forest management. Their traditions included practices that should have preserved the tree population. What seems to have happened is a combination of factors: environmental changes they couldn't control, introduced rats that ate palm seeds faster than new trees could establish, and probably some degree of social dysfunction where competitive status building undermined collective resource management. But here's the interesting part. They had warnings. Their own traditions described proper land management. The warnings were there, embedded in cultural practices. The question isn't whether the knowledge existed, it's why it stopped being followed. That's a very different kind of failure, and a more disturbing one, because it suggests that having the information isn't always enough. Sometimes the warnings are ignored because short-term pressures override long-term thinking. Sometimes because social competition creates incentives to defect from cooperative resource management. Sometimes because the people who remember the warnings lose influence or status. Sometimes because the warnings themselves become so wrapped up in other cultural baggage that people can't separate the useful information from the outdated tradition. You see this tension constantly in historical records once writing becomes common enough. Arguments between people who want to preserve old practices and people who think the old ways are superstitious nonsense. Usually, both sides have a point. The old practices often do contain useful embedded knowledge, but they're also mixed with genuinely superstitious elements that served social functions rather than practical ones. Figuring out which is which, that's the hard part. And it's hard precisely because the encoding system works so well. The useful information and the social ritual became so thoroughly integrated that separating them requires exactly the kind of analytical thinking that wasn't available when the system was created. You're in Japan now, sometime in the early 17th century, in a coastal village that seems peaceful and prosperous. Fishing boats bob in the harbour. Children play on the beach. The houses are well built. The fields are productive. And life is good. Except there's this weird thing. The oldest buildings in the village aren't actually in the village. They're farther up the hill, maybe a quarter mile from the current settlement, on land that seems less convenient, less accessible, and less obviously desirable. When you ask why, you get vague answers about tradition, about ancestors, and about the proper way to build. Some villages have stone markers, really old ones, with inscriptions that say things like, "Do not build below this point." The inscriptions are weathered, barely legible, and obviously ancient. Most people know they're there but don't think much about them. Old religious thing probably. Superstition from a more ignorant time. December 22nd, 1615. Earthquake. Not unusual for Japan. They happen all the time. This one feels strong, sure, but houses are built to flex and sway. Some roof tiles fall. A few walls crack. Nobody dies in the village. People start cleaning up, making repairs, and being grateful it wasn't worse. Then someone notices the water in the harbour is behaving strangely. Pulling back, way back, farther than the lowest tide. Boats are sitting on the exposed harbour bottom. Fish are flopping in puddles. It looks bizarre, unprecedented, and almost comical. The people who live in the houses up on the hill, the old houses built in the supposedly inconvenient location, start running farther uphill. They're screaming something about the water, about getting to high ground, about danger. They sound absolutely panicked, which seems like an overreaction. The earthquake is over, the worst of it anyway. 40 minutes after the earthquake, a wall of water roughly 30 feet high hits the coast. The village is gone in minutes. Hundreds of people drown. The houses on the hill, the ones that seem pointlessly far from the shore, untouched, wet, but standing. The people who listened to the old warnings, who remembered what those stone markers really meant. Alive. Japan has a word for this, tsunami, and the historical record shows they happen along that coast roughly every few generations. Not frequently enough that everyone remembers, not rare enough that they're irrelevant. Exactly the wrong frequency for human memory, where each generation grows up in the gap between events and decides the warnings are probably exaggerated. The stone markers were put there by survivors of previous tsunamis. Some were over 400 years old when the 1615 wave hit. The inscriptions weren't religious or metaphorical. They were literal instructions. High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build any homes below this point. Straightforward, clear, utterly ignored by people who thought they knew better. This pattern repeats itself across cultures and centuries. Warnings that seem superstitious or overcautious until the moment they're proven catastrophically accurate. The problem is, the proof usually comes too late to help the people who needed the warning most. You can find similar stories in volcanic regions. Villages with traditions about which mountainsides are safe and which are forbidden. The forbidden zones often correspond exactly to pyroclastic flow paths from previous eruptions. Eruptions that happened so long ago that they exist only in geological records and distorted cultural memory. Mount Vesuvius has a long history of eruptions before the famous one in 79 AD that destroyed Pompeii. The local populations knew the mountain was dangerous. They had stories about the god's anger, about fire from the mountain, and about the importance of making offerings to prevent catastrophe. What they'd lost was the specific knowledge of how bad it could get, and how fast it could happen. The cultural memory had degraded from "this mountain can bury entire cities in a day" to "this mountain is sacred and sometimes dangerous. Respect it." Same basic source, very different level of useful detail. The warning was still there, technically. It just wasn't clear enough or specific enough to motivate people to actually leave. Pompeii is heartbreaking from this perspective. You can see in the archaeological record that some people tried to flee when the eruption started. Others sheltered in their homes, apparently thinking the safest course was to wait it out. Neither group understood what was coming. The cultural memory of how devastating a full Vesuvian eruption could be had faded across the generations of relative quiet. Here's the thing about volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, floods, and other geological events. They operate on time frames that make them really difficult for human memory to handle. If a disaster happens every 5 years, you remember it. You prepare for it. You develop robust responses. If it happens every 500 years, though, that's roughly 20 generations. The first few generations after the event remember it vividly, build monuments, and create warnings. But each successive generation, growing up without direct experience of the danger, discounts the warnings a little more. Archaeologists find this pattern everywhere. Settlements built in flood zones that were clearly devastated by flooding in previous centuries. Cities reconstructed on the same spot after destruction, often with building techniques that replicate the vulnerabilities of the original. Coastal communities positioned exactly where previous coastal communities were wiped out by storms or tsunamis. It's not stupidity. It's the combination of fertile land, good harbours, and fading memory. The reasons to build in a particular spot are immediate and obvious. The reasons not to build there are historical and abstract. Unless you have strong institutional memory, writing, monuments, enforced traditions, the immediate always wins. The really fascinating cases are where you can track the memory degradation through historical records. A disaster happens. Survivors leave detailed accounts, dates, descriptions, impacts, and warnings to future generations. A century later, those accounts are still read and referenced, but they're starting to seem distant, possibly exaggerated. 2 centuries later, they're historical curiosities. 3 centuries later, they're folklore. 4 centuries later, they're largely forgotten except as a vague tradition. Then the disaster happens again, and someone discovers those old accounts and realizes they were completely accurate. This happened with the New Madrid earthquakes in the central United States. Massive earthquakes hit in 1811 and 1812. The ground liquefied. The Mississippi River temporarily ran backward. Church bells rang from the vibrations as far away as Boston. It was extensively documented and genuinely terrifying. Within 2 generations, people were building in the same areas as if nothing had happened. The written records existed, but the emotional urgency had faded. Today, those areas include major cities with infrastructure built to standards that wouldn't survive a repeat of the 1811 event. The warnings are there in historical records and geological surveys. They're just competing with 150 years of "but nothing bad has happened yet." Let's talk about food for a minute, because food-related warnings are some of the most interesting cases where mythology preserved genuinely useful information while making it sound completely mystical. You're in ancient Greece, sometime around 400 BC, and you're hungry. Not desperately hungry, just regular human hungry. You see some mushrooms growing near the path. They look edible. Should you eat them? If you're smart, you consult the traditions, and the traditions tell you a complicated story about how some mushrooms are sacred to certain gods, how others are favoured by nymphs, and how still others are touched by underworld spirits and must never be consumed. The stories are elaborate, specific, and memorable. They're also, when you strip away the mythology, a field guide to local mushrooms. The sacred to Demeter mushrooms, probably edible and nutritious. The favoured by nymphs ones, edible but with psychoactive properties. Consume carefully, in ritual context, not as casual snacks. The touched by underworld spirits. Those will absolutely kill you. The mythology encodes information that's more reliable than just guessing based on appearance. This pattern shows up in food traditions worldwide. Kosher laws in Judaism, halal restrictions in Islam, Hindu dietary practices, Buddhist precepts about meat consumption, Polynesian kapu systems. When you look at them from a purely biological standpoint, most of them correlate with practices that reduce disease risk, prevent food poisoning, or manage resources sustainably in specific environments. Pork restrictions in Middle Eastern religions emerge in regions where pork is hard to raise sustainably, and where improperly cooked pork carries serious parasitic risks. Shellfish restrictions often align with seasonal toxin blooms. Prohibitions on mixing meat and dairy might reduce certain types of food poisoning in hot climates without refrigeration. The religious framework makes these practices mandatory and memorable, rather than optional and forgettable. Are these restrictions the only possible solution to the problems they address? Number. Modern food safety practices handle the same issues differently and often more effectively. But the religious restrictions worked for societies that didn't have refrigeration, lab testing, or pasteurization. They encoded practical knowledge in a format that didn't require scientific understanding to be useful. The same thing happens with seasonal food restrictions. Many traditional societies had elaborate rules about when you could and couldn't eat certain foods. These often sound arbitrary until you look at them ecologically. The restrictions tend to align with breeding seasons, migration patterns, or times when the food in question is nutritionally poor or potentially toxic. Pacific Northwest indigenous groups had traditions about when to harvest shellfish. These traditions included months when certain shellfish were taboo, forbidden for consumption. When scientists finally mapped paralytic shellfish poisoning events in the region, They found the taboo periods corresponded almost exactly with the highest risk months for algal blooms that make shellfish toxic. The traditional knowledge holders didn't know about dinoflagellate blooms or saxitoxin. They knew that people got sick when they ate shellfish during certain times, and they encoded that observation in cultural practice, enforced by social and spiritual sanctions. The mechanism didn't matter. The outcome did. You see similar patterns with agricultural timing, planting calendars tied to religious festivals, harvest rituals that also served as deadlines for getting crops in before the weather turned. Fallow periods were described as sacred rest for the land, but which, incidentally, prevented soil depletion and managed pest populations. The Roman calendar of festivals is a good example. It looks like pure religious observance until you map it against agricultural needs. Then you notice that major festivals conveniently fall right when specific farm tasks need to happen. The religious obligation ensured people coordinated their agricultural work, even when the immediate incentive might be to delay or skip crucial steps. Same with building practices. Feng Shui, when you strip away the mystical language, contains a lot of practical architectural knowledge about drainage, ventilation, light exposure, and protection from prevailing winds. The spiritual framework made these practices prestigious and ensured they were preserved and transmitted even when people didn't consciously understand the benefits. Viking settlements in marginal environments like Iceland and Greenland had elaborate traditions about building orientation, room design, and resource management. Many of these traditions seem arbitrary until you realize they're optimized for survival in environments with limited resources and harsh conditions. The proper way to build a longhouse turns out to be the way that maximizes heat retention and minimizes fuel consumption. Traditional Japanese building techniques developed in a seismically active region include design elements that modern engineers recognize as earthquake-resistant, flexible joints, foundation designs that absorb shock, weight distribution that makes structures more stable during shaking. These weren't developed through mathematical modelling. They emerged through centuries of trial and error, preserved as the proper way to build, and passed down as traditional knowledge. When you start looking for this pattern, you find it everywhere. Traditional medicine that actually works alongside the stuff that doesn't. Navigation techniques that sound like magic, but which encode real knowledge about currents, stars, and bird behaviour. Weather prediction based on animal behaviour that correlates with atmospheric pressure, changes humans can't directly sense, but animals apparently can. The tricky part is that it's all mixed together. Real knowledge and pure superstition, practical wisdom and social control, useful information and outdated tradition that serve different purposes in different contexts. You can't just accept all traditional knowledge as valid, but you also can't dismiss it all as primitive superstition. Each piece needs to be evaluated on its own merits. This is why ethnobotany became such an important field. Researchers realized that indigenous peoples had encyclopedic knowledge about local plants, their properties, their uses, and their dangers. This knowledge was encoded in stories, traditions, and practices that often sounded mystical or superstitious to outsiders. But when you actually tested the plants in question, you frequently found that the traditional uses had a biochemical basis. Willow bark tea for pain and fever contains salicin, which the body converts to salicylic acid, basically natural aspirin. Foxglove for heart conditions contains cardiac glycosides still used in modern medicine. Cinchona bark for malaria contains quinine. The list goes on. The traditional healers didn't know the chemical mechanisms. They knew that when you gave someone with certain symptoms a preparation made from a specific plant, the symptoms often improved. They encoded this knowledge in training systems, ritual practices, and stories that preserved the information across generations. Sometimes the encoding was remarkably precise. Dosage information hidden in ritual procedures, preparation methods that maximize beneficial compounds while minimizing toxic ones, contraindications disguised as spiritual prohibitions, all of it wrapped in frameworks that made the knowledge sacred and therefore worth preserving. Not all disasters announce themselves. The subtle ones, the ones that creep up over generations, are the hardest to warn about and the easiest to ignore. You're in the Maya lowlands, around 900 AD, in a city that will be abandoned within your lifetime. The problem isn't obvious. There's no invasion, no plague, no earthquake. The problem is water. Specifically, the slow, steady depletion of reliable water sources combined with irregular rainfall and increasing difficulty feeding a population that grew during good years and now can't be sustained during lean ones. The warning signs were there for generations. The monuments and inscriptions show increasingly frantic appeals to gods for rain. The archaeological evidence shows water management systems being expanded, modified, and desperately enhanced. The rulers knew something was wrong. The question is whether anyone else did, and whether anyone could have done anything about it even if they understood the problem. This is the hardest kind of warning to encode in mythology. The slow-moving disaster that doesn't have a clear beginning or end. That might be solvable if addressed early, but becomes catastrophic if ignored too long. How do you create a memorable warning about soil depletion, about groundwater levels dropping, about complex system feedback loops that take decades to manifest? The Maya had sophisticated astronomical knowledge. Their calendar systems were remarkable. Their mathematical achievements were genuinely impressive. What they apparently didn't have, or couldn't act on, was a clear understanding that their agricultural system was slowly degrading the environment that supported it. Or maybe they understood and couldn't change it. That's possibly more disturbing. The city-states were competing with each other. Each ruler needed to demonstrate power and prosperity. Admitting resource constraints would mean political weakness. The incentives all pushed toward maintaining growth even when the underlying resource base was clearly stressed. You see this same pattern in other slowly collapsing societies. Easter Island again, though the story's more complicated than the usual version. The ancestral Puebloans in the American Southwest, who built elaborate settlements and then abandoned them as water sources failed. The Greenland Norse, who maintained European agricultural practices in an environment that increasingly couldn't support them, and apparently couldn't or wouldn't adapt to hunting-based lifestyles that would have been more sustainable. The warnings exist in these cases, but they're diffuse and arguable. Rain isn't as predictable as it used to be. Is that a trend or just normal variation? The harvest isn't as good as it was 20 years ago. Is that because of soil depletion, or just a run of bad luck? The forest seems thinner, but forests grow back, right? Without statistical analysis and long-term record keeping, these trends are really hard to distinguish from noise. And humans are spectacularly good at normalizing gradually worsening conditions. The baseline shifts with each generation. What seems obviously degraded to an outside observer seems normal to people who grew up with it. Psychologists call this shifting baseline syndrome. If you never experienced the previous state, you don't know it's been lost. Each generation accepts as normal the conditions they grew up with, even if those conditions are significantly degraded from what existed before. The slow decline becomes invisible because it's never dramatic enough to trigger alarm. This is why writing matters so much for preserving these kinds of warnings. Living memory only goes back so far. Stories can preserve information longer, but they're subject to the same baseline shifting. The forest was thick becomes the forest was thick, even as the actual forest keeps thinning, and the mental image of thick adjusts downward. Written records, ideally with quantitative measurements, can show the trend clearly. You can see that the grain yields really are declining, that the water table really is dropping, that the forest really is shrinking. Numbers don't shift their baseline the way human perception does. But even written records only help if people pay attention to them, and if the political and economic systems allow for action, based on long-term trends rather than short-term incentives. The tragedy of many collapsed societies isn't that they didn't know they were in trouble, it's that the social structure couldn't respond effectively to gradually mounting pressure. The Greenland Norse knew they were struggling. The records show they were aware conditions were deteriorating. What they couldn't do, apparently, was abandon the livestock-based economy and European identity that defined who they were. They kept trying to be European farmers in an environment that was becoming increasingly unsuitable for European farming, even as the indigenous Inuit population managed fine by hunting and fishing. Cultural identity became a trap. The warnings about needing to change were there, but accepting them would mean becoming something else, something that wasn't Norse in the way that mattered to them. So they stayed loyal to an identity and a set of practices that were killing them, and eventually the settlements failed. You can see the same dynamic in modern contexts. Industries facing obsolescence are fighting against adaptation. Communities refusing to relocate from flood zones or fire-prone areas, because that's where they've always been. People maintain unsustainable lifestyles because changing would mean admitting the old way doesn't work anymore. The warnings are there, the data is available. But accepting the warnings requires accepting change that feels like loss of identity or status or control. So the warnings are rationalized away, dismissed as exaggerated, and treated as problems for future generations to solve. Something interesting started happening in the 19th and 20th centuries. Archaeologists and anthropologists began taking traditional knowledge seriously, not as quaint folklore, but as potential sources of actual information about history and environment. You're in Crete in the early 1900s, watching Arthur Evans excavate Knossos. He's uncovering a Bronze Age palace that's remarkably sophisticated. Multiple stories, indoor plumbing, elaborate frescoes, evidence of a complex bureaucracy and extensive trade networks. A civilization that Greek mythology remembered as the kingdom of King Minos, and the labyrinth that held the Minotaur. Now, there's obviously no actual Minotaur. But Evan starts noticing something interesting. The palace really is maze-like, with corridors that twist and turn and double back. There are bull motifs everywhere in the artwork. The architecture is complex enough that someone unfamiliar with it could easily get lost. The myth of the labyrinth and the Minotaur suddenly looks less like pure fiction, and more like a distorted memory of an actual place. A palace complex associated with bull worship or bull sacrifice, remembered across the Dark Age that followed the Bronze Age collapse, transformed in the retelling into a monster story but preserving core details about the place and the culture. This opened a door. If the labyrinth myth had a basis in reality, what about other myths? What about flood stories, dragon legends, and tales of lost cities and sunken lands? The answer turned out to be complicated. Some myths are pure fiction. Others are distorted memories of real events. Still others preserve information about geology, astronomy, or natural phenomena encoded in narrative form. The Black Sea deluge hypothesis is a fascinating case. There's geological evidence that around 5600 BC, the Black Sea underwent catastrophic flooding when rising Mediterranean sea levels breached the Bosporus. The water level rose hundreds of feet over a relatively short period, maybe months or years rather than centuries. Coastal settlements would have been inundated. Now, did this event directly inspire the Noah's Ark story and similar flood myths from the region? That's arguable and probably unprovable, but it demonstrates that the kind of catastrophic flooding described in those myths absolutely happened in regions where the myths originated. The myths aren't necessarily records of the specific event, but they're not entirely invented either. They're memories of the kind of thing that happened, encoded in story form and preserved across millennia. Dragon myths are another interesting case. Dinosaur fossils have been found in many regions where dragon legends exist. Did ancient peoples find these fossils, recognize them as bones, and construct the idea of dragons to explain them? Almost certainly yes in many cases. The fossils are real. The interpretation is creative. The myth preserves both. The knowledge that giant reptilian creatures existed, and a culturally specific explanation of what they were. Some dragon legends even preserve surprisingly accurate anatomical details when you compare them to the fossils found in the same regions. Chinese dragon descriptions correlate weirdly well with local theropod fossils. European dragon legends often match the general body plan of sauropods. The ancients were doing paleontology. They just didn't have evolutionary theory or geological timescales to contextualize their findings. Volcano myths similarly preserve real information. The Greek legend of Typhon, a monster buried under Mount Etna whose struggles cause earthquakes and eruptions, is obviously not literally true, but it preserves the knowledge that Etna is geologically active, that eruptions and earthquakes are connected, and that the mountain has been dangerous for as long as anyone can remember. The monster is a mnemonic device for geological truth. Indigenous Australian oral traditions describe events that, when checked against geological and archaeological evidence, appear to preserve memories of sea level changes from the end of the last ice age. Events that happened over 10,000 years ago. Stories about lands that are now underwater, about the sea rising and covering what was once dry ground, match precisely with what geological surveys show actually happened. How do oral traditions preserve information for 10,000 years? Through the same mechanisms we've been discussing, encoding in memorable narrative form, making the stories sacred or culturally important, passing them down through specialized knowledge keepers, and maintaining them through ritual repetition. It's an incredibly robust system for preserving information, even if it distorts and mythologizes in the process. The challenge for modern researchers is developing methods to extract the factual core from the mythological packaging. Some methods are pretty straightforward. If a myth describes a volcano erupting, check whether there's geological evidence of eruptions in that region during the time frame when the culture existed. If the myth describes flooding, look for flood deposits or evidence of sea level changes. Other cases require more sophisticated analysis, computational linguistics to trace how stories changed as they spread, genetic analysis to track human migrations that might have carried stories with them, climate reconstruction to understand what environmental conditions people were experiencing when they created specific myths. There's a whole field now called geomythology that specifically studies the geological events preserved in myths and legends. Researchers systematically go through traditional stories looking for descriptions that might correspond to earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, floods, and other natural phenomena, then check whether the geological record supports those events. The results are fascinating. Many myths turn out to preserve genuinely useful information about local hazards. The Cascadia subduction zone, which generates massive earthquakes every few hundred years along the Pacific Northwest coast, is documented in indigenous oral traditions that describe the last major event around 1700 AD. Those traditions were largely dismissed by European settlers, but geological evidence confirmed they were accurate. Similarly, Australian Aboriginal stories about volcanic eruptions in regions that are now dormant turned out to correlate with geological evidence of eruptions thousands of years ago. The stories preserved information about which mountains were dangerous, even after they'd been quiet for so long that direct memory had faded. This process of rediscovering ancient warnings through scientific analysis is ongoing. Every year brings new examples of traditional knowledge that turns out to be accurate, and warnings that were dismissed as superstition, but which encoded genuine understanding of environmental risks and natural phenomena. The tragedy is how much knowledge was lost when cultures were disrupted or destroyed. How many warnings went unheard because the people who preserved them were marginalized or killed? How much information is gone forever because we didn't think to record it before the last person who remembered it died? Here's where things get uncomfortable, because this isn't just about ancient peoples and their quaint myths. We're still doing it, right now, ignoring warnings that are encoded in historical records, geological surveys, climate data, and scientific analysis. Dismissing expert knowledge because it conflicts with what we want to believe or what's economically convenient. You're in New Orleans in 2005 and Hurricane Katrina is approaching. The warnings have been clear for decades. The city is below sea level. The levees aren't built to withstand a major hurricane. The wetlands that once provided natural storm protection have been degraded. Disaster planners have been saying for years that a direct hit from a major hurricane would be catastrophic. And then it happens exactly as predicted. The levees fail, the city floods, thousands of people die or lose everything, and in the aftermath, everyone acts surprised, as if this was an unforeseeable tragedy rather than a disaster that had been explicitly warned about for generations. This is the modern version of building below the tsunami stones. The warnings were there. The knowledge existed. The scientific understanding was clear. The political and economic systems just couldn't or wouldn't act on information that would have required difficult, expensive, long-term planning. Climate change is the ultimate example. The warnings have been clear since at least the 1980s. The data keeps getting stronger. The predictions keep being confirmed by observation. And yet the response remains glacially slow, because acting on the warnings would require massive economic restructuring, and because the worst consequences seem distant and abstract. It's the same pattern we've been discussing throughout. Warnings that seem urgent to people with long-term perspective and specialised knowledge, but which get filtered through social, political and economic systems that privilege short-term thinking and immediate payoffs. Future archaeologists, assuming they exist, will probably look back at our era with the same baffled frustration that we feel looking at societies that built in tsunami zones or overgrazed their land into desert. The warnings were all there. Why didn't they listen? The answer is the same as it has always been. Warnings compete with other priorities. They require accepting uncomfortable truths. They demand changes that feel costly or disruptive. They ask people to prepare for events that might not happen in their lifetime. All of this is hard, and it's always been hard, and there's no reason to think we're any better at it than our ancestors were. But here's the thing. We do have one advantage they lacked. We have comprehensive written records. We have scientific methods. We have the ability to model complex systems and make quantitative predictions. You can't claim we don't know what happens when you ignore environmental warnings, or build in hazardous locations, or deplete resources faster than they regenerate. The knowledge is available. The warnings exist. Whether we listen to them is a choice, not an inevitability. Some places do listen. The Netherlands has built one of the most sophisticated flood control systems in the world because they learned, over centuries of devastating floods, that you either manage water or it manages you. Japan has strict building codes and public education about earthquakes and tsunamis because they've learnt the cost of ignoring those risks. These aren't perfect systems. They fail sometimes, but they represent societies that took historical warnings seriously and built infrastructure and institutions around the knowledge that certain disasters were inevitable and required permanent vigilance. Other places keep learning the same lessons over and over, building in fire-prone areas, overdrawing aquifers, developing coastal regions that will be underwater in a few decades. The warnings are ignored not because they're unclear, but because accepting them would be inconvenient. The ancient myths weren't just stories, they were survival guides. The problem is, we've gotten so good at ignoring our own modern versions, the scientific reports, the historical data, the expert warnings, that we've recreated the same dynamic, just with better documentation of our own failure to listen. Here's something that would be funny if it weren't tragic. We're better at decoding ancient warnings than acting on modern ones. Archaeologists can look at settlement patterns and say, they ignored obvious flood risk and paid the price. And then we go home to cities with the same vulnerabilities. We study collapsed societies that overexploited their resources and then continue policies that do exactly the same thing at a global scale. The warnings from the past aren't just about understanding history. They're mirrors showing us our own behaviour. The same psychological and social dynamics that made ancient peoples ignore warnings about earthquakes or floods or resource depletion are still operating. We haven't evolved beyond those limitations. We just have them documented in more detail. Sometimes the most important warnings are the ones that don't exist. The absence of certain myths or traditions can tell you as much as their presence. If a culture has elaborate earthquake preparation rituals, you know they experienced earthquakes frequently enough to develop cultural responses. If they have no such traditions, it might mean earthquakes are rare in that region. or it might mean they never survived an earthquake long enough to develop traditions about it. This is the dark side of traditional knowledge. It only exists for hazards that people survived often enough to learn from. The truly catastrophic, truly rare events might leave no cultural memory at all. If everyone in a coastal region drowns in a tsunami that happens once every 1,000 years, who's left to pass down the warning? Archaeology reveals this pattern through the ruins, settlements that were clearly destroyed suddenly and completely, with no evidence of rebuilding on the same site. Whatever happened was bad enough that survivors either couldn't return or chose not to. The cultural knowledge about that specific disaster died with the settlement. This creates dangerous gaps. Modern development might happen in exactly those catastrophically risky areas, because there's no cultural memory of the risk, no local tradition warning against it. The absence of warnings gets interpreted as safety rather than as the absence of survivors who could warn. The Pacific Northwest earthquake risk is a good example. Because major Cascadia events happen roughly every 300 to 600 years, European settlers arrived during a quiet period. There were no earthquakes in living memory, no written records. The indigenous oral traditions that preserved the warnings were dismissed or ignored. So development proceeded as if the region were geologically stable. It's not stable. It's a subduction zone capable of magnitude 9 earthquakes and devastating tsunamis. The last one happened in 1700. The next one is coming. But for generations, people built there without understanding the risk, because the cultural memory had been disrupted and the geological memory wasn't yet understood. We're better at reading geological memory now. Core samples, sediment layers, tree ring analysis, radiocarbon dating. We can find the evidence of events that left no cultural memory because they were too devastating or too rare for oral tradition to preserve. But that raises a disturbing question. What are we still missing? What geological risks exist that happen so rarely that even our historical records don't capture them? We've been keeping detailed scientific records for maybe 2 centuries. That's nothing on geological timescales. Supervolcanoes erupt every 50,000 to 100,000 years or so. Our entire civilization has developed in the gap between events. We know they happen. The geological evidence is clear. But we have no cultural memory of what it's like to live through one. No traditions about how to survive or prepare, because no human society has experienced one and survived in a way that preserved useful information. The same applies to asteroid impacts large enough to cause global devastation. They happen, but on timescales so long that we have no cultural or even species memory of the last major one. The warnings exist only in our scientific understanding of probability and in the geological record of ancient impacts. This is where modern science becomes our new form of cultural memory. We're encoding warnings about risks that no previous human has survived, based on physical evidence and mathematical modelling rather than direct experience. The question is whether our institutions are robust enough to maintain and act on these warnings across the centuries or millennia before the risks materialise. It's a weird situation. Ancient peoples encoded knowledge from direct experience into myths that got distorted but survived for thousands of years. We're trying to encode knowledge from abstract analysis into institutions and records that might or might not survive long enough to be useful. Which system is more reliable? Honestly, it's not clear. The mythological encoding was remarkably robust but lost precision and clarity. Scientific recording is precise, but depends on institutional continuity that's hard to maintain across long time periods. If you step back and look at the whole sweep of human history, a pattern emerges. It's not a happy pattern. Societies develop in environments they don't fully understand. Through trial and error, often painful, they accumulate knowledge about how to survive in those environments. This knowledge gets encoded in cultural practices, stories, and traditions. For a while, the system works. The warnings are heeded. The practices are followed. Then conditions change, or memory fades, or competing priorities emerge. The warnings start to seem overblown or irrelevant. New generations who haven't experienced the disasters firsthand discount the old stories. Development happens in places that were traditionally avoided. Practices that protected against specific risks are abandoned as superstitious. And then the disaster happens again. The flood, the earthquake, the famine, the collapse. Survivors realize the old warnings were accurate. The cycle begins again. This has happened so many times that you'd think we'd learn. But the learning keeps getting lost. Each iteration thinks it's different, that the old warnings don't apply, and that modern knowledge or technology has solved the underlying problems. Sometimes that's true. Modern earthquake engineering really does make buildings safer than traditional construction in many cases. Modern flood control can manage risks that would have been unmanageable in the past. Scientific understanding allows us to predict and prepare for disasters in ways our ancestors couldn't, but the fundamental dynamic hasn't changed. We still build in risky places because they're economically attractive. We still discount long-term risks for short-term gains. We still struggle to maintain institutional memory across generations. We still have trouble acting on warnings about disasters that haven't happened yet in living memory. The myths were warnings. The archaeological ruins are warnings. The historical records are warnings. The scientific data are warnings. We're surrounded by warnings, layers upon layers of accumulated human experience with catastrophe and collapse. And we're still, in many cases, not listening. Because listening would be inconvenient, or expensive, or politically difficult, or because the warnings are about things that seem distant and abstract. The ancient peoples who built below the tsunami stones had reasons too. Good reasons from their perspective, better land, closer to resources. The old warnings seemed exaggerated. Nothing bad had happened in living memory. We're doing the same thing, just with better documentation of our decision-making process. If you're reading this in some far future, after whatever disasters our current societies are ignoring finally happen, here's what we knew, and when we knew it. We knew climate was changing. We had detailed measurements, sophisticated models, and clear warnings about consequences. The knowledge existed by the late 20th century at the latest. We chose to act slowly and inadequately, with lots of arguing about costs and responsibility. We knew many coastal cities were vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge. The engineering was clear. We kept building there anyway. We knew our agricultural systems were depleting soil and groundwater. We knew our consumption patterns were unsustainable. We knew plastic was accumulating in the oceans. We knew biodiversity was crashing. We had reports, data, and scientific consensus. All the warnings existed. We're not innocent. We're not ignorant. We're just bad at acting on information about slow-moving long-term problems, especially when the solutions would require changing comfortable patterns or confronting powerful interests. Sound familiar? It should. It's the same story that's played out in collapsed societies throughout history. The details change, the underlying dynamic doesn't. Here's hoping you future people are better at this than we were, but honestly you'll probably have your own warnings that you're ignoring, your own slow catastrophes that seem too distant or too expensive to address. That's apparently what humans do. The myths were warnings. This is a warning too. Not from gods or spirits, but from the simple observation that ignoring long-term risks in favour of short-term convenience rarely ends well. The ancient warnings weren't myths. They were instructions. The tragedy isn't that people forgot them. It's that each generation has to relearn the same lessons, usually the hard way, because the warnings never feel urgent enough until it's too late. So if you're from the future, sifting through our ruins and wondering why we didn't change course when all the information was available, now you know. We knew. We just didn't act on what we knew, because that's what humans do. We're really good at encoding warnings for future generations. We're much worse at listening to the warnings previous generations left us. The myths weren't myths, they were survival guides. By the time you realise that, you've usually already ignored them. That's the pattern. That's always been the pattern. And unless something fundamental changes in how humans process risk and time and collective action, it'll probably keep being the pattern. Welcome to the human condition. We're really good at learning from experience. We're just terrible at learning from warnings about experiences we haven't had yet, even when those warnings come from people who already had those experiences and tried to tell us what to expect. The stories were true. That's the thing nobody wants to believe until it's too late. The old warnings, the ancient instructions, the myths that sounded too dramatic to be real. They were usually based on something. They were encoding knowledge that cost previous generations dearly to acquire. And then we ignore them anyway, because that's what humans do. Sweet dreams.